Welcome. My name is Caroline Newton, and in this session I will introduce a critical perspective that helps to better understand our city's current uneven and unequal development. In addition, I will introduce the concept of spatial justice as a guiding principle for future city planning. The critical approach I will present here is not something new. It is grounded in the work of the Frankfurt School. During the 1930s, when capitalism but also fascism was on the rise in Europe, the Frankfurt School brought together a group of intellectuals and political thinkers who were deeply unhappy with the socio-economic systems of the time, and they investigated the possibilities of societal change. For the members of the Frankfurt School, this idea of promoting societal change was crucial. Thus, while they considered it vital to investigate the various injustices that cause human misery, poverty, and inequality, critical theory was also used to investigate emancipatory alternatives. Critical theory can thus be understood as a dialectical critique. It criticizes systematic exclusions and oppressions and injustices, and secondly, it affirms the possibilities for human liberation. Marcuse reflected on the possible contributions of critical theory to the current challenges. And more specifically, he wondered how we could move from a critical urban theory to a radical urban practice and planning that supports the right to the city for all, a concept we will come back to. Marcuse suggests a three-phase strategy that consists of exposing, proposing, and politicizing. The first step is exposing. Here, the root of the problem is studied, and next to collecting information and analyzing the current situation, injustices are explicitly exposed. The second stage is to propose. It is the stage of strategy development. These strategies tackle issues exposed in the first phase and formulate desired outcomes and envisage changes. The proposed strategies can be spatial, but most probably also contain social or legal actions. And the third step is then to politicize. The appropriate channels are used to convey future operations, political initiatives, and action plans. We can use this approach when we want to address the current uneven development of our cities, as mentioned in the beginning. But in addition to this approach, it is also helpful to better understand the urban space in which we want to intervene. Until the second half of the 19th century, space was merely the canvas for human activities. The spatial turn in the humanities, influenced by the work of Lefebvre, de Certeau, Foucault, and others, marks a shift and stressed the plurality of spaces and spatial production. Space became an ontological category. Human beings are no longer merely defined as temporal and social beings, but also as spatial beings. Space is understood as socially produced. In 1974, Lefebvre writes La production de l'espace. He argues that space is a complex social construction, not an abstract or a neutral given. Lefebvre's approach provides a good framework to understand how people and space interact and how people's sense-making works. He suggests to understand space through a triad of conceived, perceived, and lived spaces. Each of them has a specific and clear role in the reproduction of society and the maintenance of a system's hegemony. The conceived spaces are those created by professionals, by experts such as planners, architects, scientists. The representations of space are thus infused with their specific knowledges and colored by their normative positions and ideological backgrounds. The resulting products are often technical and sometimes difficult to understand for ordinary people. They emphasize the maker's expertise and their position in society. Secondly, Lefebvre speaks about the perceived space. Here, he refers to the spatial practice of people, the physicality of space, the morphology of the city, the material design of elements, all have an impact of how people use certain spaces. The daily practices of people are shaped and influenced by the materiality and the organization of space. Car-free city centers allow for a different use, as compared to heavy traffic areas. Gated communities force people to walk around them, impeding shortcuts and straight connections through the area. And finally, Lefebvre speaks about the lived space. While urban spaces are very real and material, at the same time they are intangible. They are infused and informed by imaginaries, emotions, experiences, and so forth. Certain spaces have meanings, but these meanings can be different for different people or for different groups of people. This third component of Lefebvre's trialectic is critical to understand how people make sense of their surroundings. Altogether, the interplay of the three help us to understand how urban spaces function and how inequalities are activated in these urban spaces. Thus, understanding and exposing these injustices in the three spheres is needed before ideas and alternative futures can be suggested. Edward Soya, a modern critical political geographer and urban theorist, builds on Lefebvre's work, and by critically analyzing space in its relation to the social world, he tries to understand the spatiality of justice and injustice. He does so not merely because of a theoretical interest, but in order to feed activism and support social change. Soja reminds us that inequalities have always been intrinsically linked to space's geography. Cities grew by rivers or at crossroads, not in the midst of deserted forests and deserts. Specific variables linked with a location's geography determine whether that location has greater or lesser development potential. Our environment has always been a canvas of inequality, and as a result, unequal social interactions have existed from the start. As Soja has argued, being differently located in space can have deeply oppressive and exploitative effects, especially when maintained over long periods of time and rooted in persistent divisions in society, such as those based on race, class, and gender. Spatial justice thus first involves the fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources and opportunities to use them. Secondly, acknowledges that social processes shape the spatiality or the specific geography of justice and injustice. And thirdly, it needs urban dwellers to be able to participate openly and fairly in all the processes producing urban space. Today, we are increasingly aware of the unsustainability of unjust and unequal urban growth. Distance and accessibility are two crucial factors in generating and maintaining inequality. When concentrations of desired commodities, services, and people emerge, having access to or being able to reach them becomes an essential indicator of success. We find an extreme example in South Africa, where the spatial organization was used as a weapon to keep undesirable populations away from the white elite under apartheid. Infrastructure construction, such as railways, highways, they divided people, and access controls limited people's mobility. The impact of this is still visible and palpable nearly 30 years after apartheid was abolished in 1994. It is extremely difficult to modify a social organization once it has become embedded in space. It is hopeful today that the Habitat 3 agenda reflects a widespread political commitment to the sustainable development of cities, towns, and human settlements. The United Nations recognized the critical role of planning and urban design in establishing future integrated and just societies when it adopted the new urban agenda during the Habitat 3 conference in 2016. And it has cleared the way to integrate the right to the city in spatial planning. The right to the city is a concept that came into existence in the late 1960s. The uprisings and student protests externalized the dissatisfaction with the uneven distribution of resources and goods, but also with the processes that created this uneven urban situation. In broad terms, we can understand the right to the city as twofold. It is firstly about the full use of the city and the right to appropriate it, but more importantly, it is also about a collective right to participate in the making of the city. Or, as David Harvey phrased it, the right to the city is far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. It is moreover a common rather than an individual right, since this transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of a collective power to reshape the process of urbanization. Thus, the right to the city is ultimately a strong political principle that should lead to action in which the disposed, the neglected, and the discontent can claim back the city and shape it to their needs and desires. So almost a century after the Frankfurt School was searching for ways to change the injustices and the suffering they observe, the need for a transition to a just society in which all people can live a good and happy life is today high on the international agenda. The importance of space and spatial organization as an important leverage to achieve this is made explicit in the New Urban Agenda. As a result, we must prioritize the idea of spatial justice in future urban development and particularly in the development of our cities.